Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving into
This is good.
Tony Judd's Postwar, a history of Europe since 1945.
Okay.
It's a hefty read, but
Yeah.
absolutely worth it.
Yeah, it really is.
You've chosen quite the deep dive.
A sweeping look at Europe's journey from the devastation of World War II to the early 21st century.
Wow.
Judt covers so much ground,
I know.
rebuilding the Cold War, the fall of communism.
Right.
But what makes it truly remarkable is his focus on the human experience amidst these massive historical shifts.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give our listener a quick overview of the main themes?
Sure.
Just to set the stage.
I think one of the biggest takeaways is this idea of illusions of peace.
All right.
Judd argues that the post-war period wasn't just about rebuilding, but also about forgetting. Europeans had to collectively bury the horrors of the war,
Right.
the Holocaust especially, to move forward. That silence, he says, was both necessary and unsettling.
That's heavy stuff.
Oh.
I can already see why this book is considered a classic.
Mm.
So let's start at the beginning, those immediate years after the war. What kind of picture does Judd paint?
It's bleak, to be honest. He describes Europe as a continent in ruins, both physically and psychologically. Millions dead,
Wow.
cities bombed to rubble economies shattered.
Yeah.
And on top of that, the brutal reality of displacement.
Oh, wow.
Millions of refugees,
Okay.
ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, a whole continent on the move.
It's hard to even imagine the scale of suffering.
It is.
And you mentioned the psychological toll. How did that play out in those early years?
Well, Judd argues that there was this collective desire to forget,
To forget.
to push down the trauma and rebuild. But that suppression, he says, had consequences.
Yeah.
It led to a culture of silence around the atrocities committed, particularly the Holocaust.
Right.
It's like Europe built its future on a foundation of unaddressed guilt and shame.
It's a bit like sweeping dirt under the rug, hoping it'll just disappear.
Right.
But of course it never really does.
Exactly. And Judd masterfully highlights this tension between the desire for a fresh start and the lingering shadow of the past. He even quotes from a French official at the time who said, "We must turn over the page."
Wow.
They literally wanted to close the book on the horrors of the war.
I can see how that would be tempting.
Yeah.
Almost a survival mechanism.
Right.
But it sets the stage for some interesting complexities down the line, right?
Absolutely. This buried trauma, this collective forgetting, informs a lot of the political and social developments that Judd traces throughout the book. It's
Yeah.
a theme that keeps coming back,
Okay.
haunting the progress and prosperity of the post-war era.
Okay, so we have this backdrop of devastation, displacement, and suppressed trauma.
Yeah.
How did that shape the political landscape of Europe? What new systems emerged from the ashes?
We had two very distinct paths forming.
Okay.
Western Europe and Eastern Europe. In the West, you see the rise of social democracy and the welfare state. Countries like Britain, France, and Germany implemented policies aimed at creating a more just and equitable society.
Okay.
It was about rebuilding, but also about preventing the social unrest that could lead to another war.
So learning from the mistakes of the past and
Yes.
trying to build a safety net for everyone?
Exactly. It was a radical shift in thinking.
Wow.
Healthcare, education, social security,
Mm-hmm.
these became rights,
Right.
not privileges. And it wasn't just about altruism. It was a pragmatic response to the economic and social realities of the time.
And on the flip side, in Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
you had the rise of communism under Soviet influence.
Right.
What did that look like?
It was a starkly different trajectory.
Okay.
Soviet-style communism was imposed on these countries, leading to a suppression of individual liberties and a centrally controlled economy. It was essentially a new form of domination,
Wow.
replacing Nazi occupation with Soviet control.
And this division, this clash of ideologies, sets the stage for the Cold War, right?
Precisely. The Iron Curtain descends, dividing Europe both physically and ideologically.
Right.
You have NATO forming in the West, the Warsaw Pact in the East,
Right.
and this constant tension, this threat of conflict looming over everything. Judd describes it as a long peace, a period without major war, but marked by constant anxiety and the threat of nuclear annihilation.
It must have been a pretty unsettling time to live through.
Yeah,
That fear must have seeped into every aspect of life.
it absolutely did. Judd describes how the Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical struggle, it was a psychological war.
Wow.
It shaped everyday life, influenced culture, and created a constant sense of unease.
It's fascinating how he weaves together the big picture stuff,
Yeah.
The political maneuvering, the military buildups, with the personal stories, the individual anxieties of living in a world on the edge.
Yes, and he doesn't shy away from the complexities. He talks about how the West, despite its prosperity and freedoms, also engaged in its own forms of repression and paranoia during the Cold War.
Oh, really?
There was a fear of communist infiltration, a crackdown on dissent,
Wow.
a dark underbelly to the shiny facade of capitalist democracy.
So both sides had their flaws,
Right.
their dark secrets.
Mhm.
It makes you realize that this simple binary of good versus evil,
Yeah.
which we often get in historical narratives,
Right.
is rarely accurate.
Right, and that's one of the things that makes Jutt's work so compelling. He
Yeah.
challenges these easy narratives and forces you to grapple with the messy realities of history.
We've covered a lot of ground already. The devastation of the war,
We have.
the rise of opposing ideologies, the looming threat of the Cold War. And you're just getting started.
Yeah,
This is going to be one fascinating deep dive.
it is.
But for now,
Yeah.
we need to take a little break.
Okay. Welcome back to our deep dive into Tony Jutt's Postwar.
Oh.
As we left off, Europe was divided, grappling with the legacies of war and facing a new era of ideological conflict.
Right.
But amidst the tensions, there were some surprising developments.
You're talking about the economic miracle, right?
Exactly.
Western Europe, particularly West Germany,
Yeah.
experienced this period of incredible growth and prosperity
Yeah.
in the decades following the war.
It was a remarkable turnaround.
Wow.
Countries that had been devastated by the war were rebuilding at a rapid pace, fueled by American aid through the Marshall Plan, technological innovation, and a surge in consumer demand.
It's amazing to think that just a few years after the war,
Yeah.
these societies were able to not only recover, but actually thrive.
It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but Judd also points out that it wasn't a universal experience.
Right.
There were regional disparities, pockets of poverty, and some social groups,
Right.
particularly women and immigrants, were left behind.
That makes sense. Progress rarely benefits everyone equally. So while the West was experiencing this boom, what was happening behind the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe?
Well, the picture there is much more grim.
Okay.
While there were some initial efforts at reconstruction, Eastern Europe was essentially forced into the Soviet economic model, which prioritized heavy industry and centralized planning.
Okay.
This led to stagnation shortages and a lower standard of living compared to the West.
So this economic disparity further deepens the divide between East and West, fueling the Cold War rivalry.
Absolutely. And Judd highlights how this economic gap played a key role in undermining the legitimacy of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. People could see the difference in living standards, the access to consumer goods, the freedoms enjoyed in the West,
Right.
and it fueled a growing sense of discontent.
It's one thing to be told about an ideology.
Yeah.
It's another to see its practical failures in comparison to a different system.
Right.
It must have made the promises of communism ring hollow for many people.
And that's why Judd argues that the economic miracle in the West was, in a way, a victory in the Cold War.
It wasn't just about military strength. It was about proving the superiority of the capitalist system.
It's like a real-world experiment playing out on a continental scale.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this growing economic divide, but what about everyday life?
Yeah.
How did people experience the Cold War on a personal level?
Well, Judt paints a vivid picture of life behind the Iron Curtain,
Okay.
describing the constant surveillance, the restrictions on travel and speech, the fear of being denounced to the authorities.
Wow.
It was a society where conformity was enforced and dissent was ruthlessly suppressed.
It must have felt incredibly suffocating.
It was.
Did people ever try to resist?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
There were moments of rebellion like the Hungarian Uprising in 1956 and the Prague Spring in 1968.
Yeah.
These were brutally crushed by Soviet tanks,
Wow.
but they demonstrated the yearning for freedom that existed beneath the surface.
These events are tragic,
Yeah.
but they also show the incredible courage of people who are willing to risk everything for a chance at liberty. And Judd argues that these uprisings, while ultimately unsuccessful, had a long-term impact.
Okay.
They exposed the cracks in the Soviet system, chipped away at its legitimacy, and planted the seeds of dissent that would eventually lead to its downfall.
It's like a pressure cooker.
Yeah.
The more you try to suppress it, the more likely it is to explode.
Right.
Speaking of explosions,
Mm-hmm.
the 1960s were a pretty explosive time in Western Europe as well, weren't they?
They certainly were. Judd dedicates a whole chapter to the cultural and social upheavals of the 60s, describing the rise of youth culture, the student movements, the sexual revolution, and a growing disillusionment with traditional authority.
It was a time of challenging the status quo,
Yes.
questioning everything from social norms to political systems.
Exactly. And it's fascinating how Judt connects these cultural shifts back to the themes of the war and its aftermath.
Okay.
He argues that the generation that came of age in the 60s, the baby boomers, were the first to be truly free from the shadow of the war.
Meaning they didn't have that direct experience of wartime trauma.
Yeah.
So they were more willing to challenge the existing order.
Precisely.
Yeah.
They questioned the values of their parents, the silences around the war, the materialism of consumer society. It was a generational rebellion, but it was also a reckoning with the past.
And this cultural ferment wasn't limited to the West? Did any of it seep through the Iron Curtain?
It did, though, in a much more muted and underground form.
Okay.
Just describes the emergence of dissident movements, underground art scenes,
Right.
and a growing fascination with Western music and culture, particularly rock and roll.
So even under a repressive regime, people found ways to express themselves, to connect with ideas beyond the official ideology.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this cultural exchange, even if it was limited, played a role in undermining the Soviet system.
Yeah.
It showed people that there were alternative ways of thinking, living, and creating.
It's like a crack in the wall letting in a little bit of light.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got economic miracles, Cold War anxieties, and cultural revolutions brewing.
We do.
What's next in Just's sweeping saga of post-war Europe?
Well, the 1970s brought a new set of challenges, a sense of disillusionment, and the beginning of what Judt calls the end of the post-war era. But we'll have to delve into that in part 3.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Tony Judd's post-war.
Yeah.
In the last 2 parts, we've journeyed through
We have.
the devastation and rebuilding of Europe,
Right.
the ideological clash of the Cold War,
Yeah.
and the cultural upheavals that shook both East and West.
Right.
Now we're entering the final act
Okay.
of Judd's narrative, a period he describes as the end of the post-war era. What does he mean by that?
Well, the 1970s brought a series of shocks that disrupted the relative stability and optimism of the previous decades.
Okay.
The oil crisis of 1973 sent shockwaves through the global economy, leading to inflation, unemployment, and a sense of uncertainty that hadn't been felt since the immediate post-war years.
So the economic miracle starts to lose its shine. What impact did this have on European societies?
Judt argues that these economic woes expose the underlying weaknesses of the post-war consensus. The welfare state, which had been expanding steadily, came under strain as governments struggled to maintain social programs amidst dwindling resources.
It's like a reality check, right?
Yeah.
The post-war boom couldn't last forever, and those underlying social and economic tensions started to resurface.
Exactly. And it wasn't just economics.
Uh,
There was a growing sense of disillusionment with traditional ideologies, both on the left and the right. The grand narratives of progress and social justice that had animated the post-war era were losing their appeal,
Okay.
replaced by a more cynical and individualistic outlook.
So kind of a crisis of faith in the old ways of doing things.
Yeah.
Did this open the door for new political movements?
Absolutely. The 1970s and 80s saw the rise of new political forces, often fueled by a backlash against the perceived excesses of the welfare state, a desire for greater individual freedom, and anxieties about immigration and cultural change.
This is where we see figures like Margaret Thatcher in Britain
Yeah.
and Ronald Reagan in the U.S. come to prominence, right?
Right.
Their policies emphasized free markets, limited government, and a return to traditional values.
Precisely. And while these movements had their successes, Judd also highlights the downsides. He argues that the dismantling of the welfare state led to increased inequality, social fragmentation, and a decline in public services.
It's like a pendulum swing, right?
Right.
From the collective spirit of the post-war era to a more individualistic, every man for himself ethos.
Yeah.
Did this shift have any impact on the Cold War?
Well, it certainly contributed to the escalation of tensions in the early 1980s.
Okay.
Reagan's confrontational stance towards the Soviet Union, coupled with a massive military buildup, pushed the world closer to the brink of nuclear war.
Those were some scary times. I
Yeah.
remember the feeling that the world could end at any moment.
Yeah.
But then something remarkable happened.
It did.
Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, and things started to change dramatically.
Yes. Gorbachev's arrival in 1985 was a turning point. His policies of glasnost and perestroika, intended to reform the Soviet system from within, inadvertently unleashed forces that he couldn't control.
What were those forces?
Well, for one, the loosening of censorship and the opening up of political debate allowed long-suppressed grievances and aspirations for freedom to surface.
Okay.
And the economic reforms aimed at decentralizing and revitalizing the Soviet economy only highlighted its deep-seated flaws and inefficiency.
So by trying to fix the system, Gorbachev actually exposed its fundamental weaknesses.
Right.
It's almost poetic.
It really is. And in 1989, the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall came down, revolution swept across Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Empire, which has seemed so monolithic and unyielding, simply dissolved.
It was an incredible moment, a testament to the power of human aspirations for freedom. And Judt captures the drama and excitement of those heady days beautifully. But he's also cautious, right?
He is.
He does present it as a simple triumph of good over evil.
That's right. He acknowledges the euphoria and hope that accompanied the fall of communism, but he also points out the challenges that lay ahead.
Okay.
The transition to democracy and market economies in the former communist countries was fraught with difficulties leading to economic hardship, social upheaval, and a resurgence of nationalism and ethnic conflict.
It's a reminder that historical change is rarely neat and tidy. There are always unintended consequences, lingering legacies, and new struggles to emerge.
And Judt ends his book with a reflection on this very idea. He argues that the post-war era in Europe, despite its many achievements, was ultimately a parenthesis, a period of exceptional circumstances that couldn't last forever.
So the end of the Cold War wasn't just the end of a geopolitical standoff. It was the closing of a chapter, the end of a particular way of life and understanding the world.
And he leaves us with a question.
A question.
What comes next?
Wow.
What new challenges and opportunities will Europe face in the 21st century?
It's a thought-provoking ending to a truly epic work of history. I think we've done a pretty good job of unpacking the main themes of Tony Judt's Postwar. What are some of the key takeaways that you think our listeners should ponder?
For me, one of the biggest takeaways is Jutt's emphasis on the human experience of history. He doesn't just focus on the grand events and political figures. He shows how those events impacted the lives of ordinary people, their hopes, fears, and struggles.
He reminds us that history is made by people, not just by abstract forces. And another key takeaway is this idea that the post-war era was both a time of remarkable progress and a time of unresolved traumas, suppressed memories, and hidden contradictions.
That's right. The peace and prosperity of the post-war decades were built on a foundation of unaddressed guilt and shame, and those issues eventually came back to haunt Europe.
And finally, I think Judt's analysis of the end of the Cold War is incredibly insightful. He captures the euphoria of that moment, but also the challenges and uncertainties that followed. He reminds us that history doesn't end. It just keeps unfolding in new and unexpected ways.
And that's perhaps the most important lesson of all. We need to be constantly learning from the past, questioning our assumptions, and adapting to the changing realities of the world around us.
Well said. And that's what the deep dive is all about. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Tony Judt's Post-War. We hope you've gained some new insights into this complex and fascinating period of history.
And we hope you'll continue to explore these ideas further. There's always more to learn, more to uncover, more to ponder.
Until next time, keep diving deep.